In the mountains of Afghanistan, enemy fighters had one simple rule when they spotted the small figure with the red cross on her uniform: ignore her. After all, she was just a medic. What harm could a woman carrying medical supplies possibly do to trained killers who had terrorized these valleys for years? They were about to learn the most dangerous lesson of their lives. Sometimes the most lethal weapon on a battlefield isn't the one you see coming. Sometimes it's the quiet professional you underestimate, the one who has spent years perfecting skills that go far beyond saving lives. Sometimes it's the person everyone assumes is there to heal, not to hunt. This is the true story of how 12 minutes of pure tactical brilliance turned a routine medical evacuation into military legend. This is the story of how one woman's split-second decision to act saved dozens of lives and reminded the world that courage doesn't ask for permission, and heroes don't always look like what we expect. What happened in those 12 minutes would be talked about in military circles for years to come. But it started like any other day in one of the world's most dangerous places. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Helmand Province as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her medical kit for the third time. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but it was a weight she had grown accustomed to over her 8 years of military service. Today was supposed to be routine, a word that had lost much of its meaning in Afghanistan, but still offered a small comfort to those who lived each day knowing it might be their last. Maria stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in regulation style, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. To most people, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be: a combat medic, trained to save lives in the most dangerous situations imaginable. What they couldn't see was the other training she had received, the skills she had developed in her spare time, the countless hours she had spent at shooting ranges and tactical courses back home in Texas. Her unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, had been deployed to this remote outpost for 6 months. The base, nicknamed Eagle's Nest by the soldiers, sat perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that served as a major transit route for both civilians and insurgents. It was a strategic location that required constant vigilance, but had seen relatively little action in recent weeks. The mission brief that morning had been straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated that a small village about 8 miles north had civilians who needed medical attention after an improvised explosive device had detonated near their water well. The explosion hadn't been targeting the villagers specifically, but shrapnel had injured several children and an elderly man. The Afghan National Army unit that was supposed to provide medical support had been delayed by vehicle problems, so Maria's team had been called in to help. Captain James Mitchell, the unit commander, addressed the small group gathered for the mission briefing. "This should be a simple in-and-out operation," he said, pointing to locations on a worn map spread across a wooden table. "Rodriguez will provide medical care while we establish a security perimeter. Latest intel shows the area is clear of hostile activity, but we all know how quickly that can change out here." Maria nodded along with the rest of the team. She had learned to trust intelligence reports while simultaneously preparing for them to be completely wrong. It was one of the many contradictions of military life in a combat zone, where hope and paranoia had to coexist in the same mind. The team consisted of 8 soldiers total. Besides Maria and Captain Mitchell, there was Sergeant First Class Tony Washington, the team's demolitions expert, and a man whose calm demeanor under pressure had earned him respect throughout the unit. Private First Class Jay Coleman was their communications specialist, young and eager, but with sharp instincts that had already saved the unit from walking into ambushes twice before. The 4 others were infantrymen, all experienced and reliable, all veterans of multiple deployments. As they loaded into 2 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, commonly known as MRAPs, Maria felt the familiar mix of anticipation and caution that preceded every mission. The vehicles themselves were impressive pieces of engineering, designed to withstand roadside bombs and small arms fire. But no piece of equipment was perfect. Every soldier who had spent time in these machines had stories of close calls, of moments when armor and luck had worked together to keep them alive. The journey to the village took them through terrain that seemed to change character every few miles. They passed through areas where green fields suggested life, and growth, only to enter stretches of rocky wasteland that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The contrast was striking and served as a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change in this part of the world. Maria used the travel time to review her medical supplies and mentally rehearse the procedures she might need to perform. Treating civilians, especially children, in field conditions presented unique challenges. She had to be prepared for anything from minor cuts to severe trauma injuries, all while working without the benefit of a sterile environment or advanced medical equipment. Through her headset, she could hear the routine radio chatter between their convoy and base operations. Position reports, weather updates, and status checks created a steady background noise that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The normalcy of it was almost comforting, a reminder that there were procedures and protocols designed to keep everyone as safe as possible. About halfway to their destination, they stopped at a checkpoint manned by Afghan National Police. The interaction was friendly but professional, with the local officers providing updated information about road conditions and recent activity in the area. Everything seemed normal, perhaps even quieter than usual. Private Coleman, monitoring radio frequencies as they drove, reported that civilian traffic was light, but consistent with normal patterns for that time of day. Farmers were moving livestock, a few traders were traveling between villages, and children could be seen playing in the yards of houses they passed. It was the kind of scene that reminded Maria why she had joined the military in the first place, to help protect people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. As they approached the village, Captain Mitchell's voice came through their headsets. "Remember, this is a hearts and minds operation. We're here to help, not to intimidate. Rodriguez, you take point on all medical decisions. The rest of us are here to keep you safe while you do your job." Maria appreciated the captain's approach. Too many commanders treated medics as an afterthought, but Mitchell understood that building trust with civilian populations often depended on the quality of medical care they could provide. It was a lesson the military had learned through hard experience in multiple conflicts. The village they were approaching consisted of about 30 buildings, most constructed from mud brick and arranged around a central area where the damaged well was located. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sounds of daily life carried on the morning air. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but Maria had learned not to judge situations by their surface appearance. As their vehicles rolled to a stop near the village center, local leaders emerged to greet them. The village elder, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades of hard living in a harsh land, approached with a mixture of relief and caution. Through their interpreter, he explained that the injured were gathered in a small building near the well, waiting for help to arrive. Maria gathered her medical kit and followed the elder, her mind already shifting into the focused state she had developed for treating patients under pressure. Behind her, she could hear the measured steps of her teammates as they took up defensive positions, their eyes scanning rooftops and alleyways for any sign of danger. The building where the injured waited was dimly lit, but 2 hours into the medical treatment, Maria had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The youngest girl's wounds had been cleaned and bandaged, and her shy smile when Maria gave her a small candy from her personal supplies reminded the medic why these missions mattered so much. The elderly man, whose name was Hassan, had suffered more significant shrapnel wounds to his leg and arm, but Maria's careful work had stopped the bleeding and reduced his pain considerably. The village had gradually come to life around them as word spread that American medics were providing free treatment. Other villagers with minor ailments began appearing, hoping for help with problems they had been enduring for months or even years. Maria found herself treating everything from infected cuts to chronic pain conditions, using her limited supplies as efficiently as possible while still providing meaningful relief. Captain Mitchell checked in with her every 30 minutes, but his reports were consistently positive. The security perimeter was holding without incident. Local villagers seemed genuinely grateful for their presence, and even the dogs that roamed the village had settled down after their initial excitement about visitors. It was the kind of peaceful atmosphere that made some soldiers nervous, but Mitchell had enough experience to know that sometimes quiet really was just quiet. Sergeant Washington had positioned himself on a rooftop with a clear view of the approaches to the village, his trained eye constantly scanning for anything that didn't belong. The terrain was challenging for defensive purposes, with plenty of cover that could conceal approaching threats. But it also provided excellent visibility once you knew what to look for. So far, everything he observed fell within normal patterns for rural Afghan life. Private Coleman maintained constant communication with their base, providing regular updates on their status and location. The radio chatter remained routine, with other units in the area reporting similar levels of comm activity. Intelligence reports continued to indicate no significant threat activity in their immediate vicinity, which should have been reassuring, but somehow felt too good to be true. Maria had just finished examining a young boy with a persistent cough when the village elder approached her with an expression of deep concern. Through their interpreter, he explained that his grandson had been injured in a fall several days earlier and was unable to walk properly. The family had been afraid to ask for help, not wanting to impose on the American soldiers who were already doing so much for their community. The boy, perhaps 14 years old, was brought forward on a makeshift stretcher carried by his father and uncle. Maria could see immediately that he had suffered what appeared to be a serious leg fracture, probably involving multiple bones. The injury was several days old, which complicated treatment, but she knew she could at least stabilize it and arrange for proper medical evacuation. As she worked to assess the extent of the boy's injuries, Maria became aware that more villagers were gathering around them. Word had spread that the American medic could help with serious problems, and people were beginning to arrive from neighboring settlements. It was gratifying to see how much their presence meant to these remote communities, but it also created security challenges as the number of people around them increased. Captain Mitchell noticed the growing crowd and quietly repositioned his men to maintain clear sight lines while avoiding any appearance of threatening the civilians. It was a delicate balance, maintaining security without creating the impression that they viewed the villagers as potential threats. The success of these missions often depended as much on managing perceptions as on providing actual medical care. Maria called for her evacuation kit, a specialized set of supplies designed for stabilizing patients who would need to be transported to better medical facilities. The boy's injury was beyond what she could treat in field conditions, but she could ensure he would be stable enough for the helicopter flight to the forward surgical team at their main base. As she worked, Maria found herself thinking about the contrast between this peaceful scene and the stories of violence that dominated news coverage of Afghanistan. The villagers around her were farmers and shepherds, people who wanted nothing more than to raise their families and earn honest livings. The children played games that would have been familiar to kids anywhere in the world, and the adults showed the same mixture of pride, concern, and hope that characterized parents everywhere. The boy's father stayed close as Maria worked, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he watched her manipulate his son's injured leg. Through the interpreter, he explained that they had been afraid to seek help earlier because they had heard stories of civilians being caught in fighting between different groups. The fact that American soldiers had come specifically to help, asking nothing in return, seemed almost too good to believe. Private Coleman approached with an update from base operations. Their mission time was extending longer than originally planned, but command had approved the extension given the medical needs they were addressing. A helicopter was being prepared for medical evacuation of the boy with the broken leg, and additional medical supplies would be delivered if they needed them. Sergeant Washington's voice came through their headsets with a routine security update. He had observed several vehicles moving along distant roads, but all appeared to be normal civilian traffic. A few shepherds were moving flocks in the hills around the village, their movements consistent with seasonal grazing patterns. No signs of weapons or unusual equipment had been detected. The normalcy of it all was almost surreal. Maria had been deployed to Afghanistan for 6 months, during which time she had treated gunshot wounds, bomb injuries, and casualties from rocket attacks. She had worked under fire more times than she cared to remember, racing against time to save lives while bullets snapped overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. This mission felt different, almost like the peacekeeping operation she had trained for but rarely experienced in reality. The gratitude of the villagers was genuine and touching, reminding her of the positive impact that military medical personnel could have when given the chance to focus on healing rather than surviving combat. As she finished stabilizing the boy's leg, Maria stood up to stretch her back and survey her work. In the past 3 hours, she had treated more than a dozen patients with ailments ranging from minor cuts to serious injuries. Her medical supplies were running low, but she had accomplished far more than the original mission parameters had called for. The village elder approached her again, this time accompanied by several other community leaders. Through the interpreter, they expressed their profound gratitude not just for the medical care, but for the respect and kindness the American soldiers had shown to their community. They asked if it might be possible for medical teams to visit on a regular basis, as there were other villages in the area with similar needs. The first indication of serious trouble came from Private Coleman's radio. His voice, normally calm and measured, carried a new edge of urgency as he spoke into his headset. "Base, this is Eagle 6-4. I'm picking up multiple conversations in Pashto on unencrypted frequencies. Sounds like coordination chatter, multiple groups, discussing positions, and timing." Captain Mitchell immediately moved to Coleman's position while maintaining his casual appearance to avoid alarming the villagers. The last thing they needed was to create panic among the civilians who had placed their trust in American forces. Through his earpiece, he could hear Coleman providing more details. "Sir, they're not being subtle about it. I'm hearing references to the Americans in the village and discussions about blocking escape routes." Maria felt her training taking over. The way her mind automatically shifted into combat mode while her hands continued the routine motions of packing medical supplies. She had learned to maintain normal behavior even as her situational awareness expanded to include every possible threat and response. The boy with the broken leg was ready for evacuation, but now she had to consider whether a helicopter could safely reach them. Sergeant Washington's voice crackled through their communications system with information that confirmed their worst fears. "I count at least 12 individuals moving into positions on the high ground. They're carrying weapons and moving with military precision. This isn't opportunistic harassment, it's a coordinated assault." The village elder noticed the sudden change in the Americans' behavior and approached Captain Mitchell with obvious concern. Through the interpreter, Mitchell explained that they had received reports of possible insurgent activity in the area and might need to take defensive precautions. He emphasized that the village was not the target, but that the presence of American forces might have attracted unwanted attention. Maria's mind raced through the tactical situation. They were in an indefensible position, surrounded by buildings that could conceal attackers and with limited escape routes. Their 2 vehicles provided some protection, but against a coordinated assault by 12 or more fighters, they would be outnumbered and outgunned. The presence of civilians complicated every possible response, as any firefight in the village would inevitably put innocent people at risk. Private Coleman's radio intercepts were becoming more specific and more alarming. "Captain, they're definitely talking about us. I'm hearing references to timing, coordination with other groups, and something about blocking the road we used to get here. They know our vehicle types and our approximate numbers." The realization hit Maria with cold clarity. This wasn't a chance encounter with insurgents who happened to spot American forces. This was a planned ambush, carefully coordinated and probably days in the making. The quiet morning, the peaceful atmosphere, even the medical emergency that had brought them here, all of it might have been orchestrated to put them in this exact position at this exact time. Captain Mitchell gathered his team leaders for a quick tactical conference while maintaining the appearance of normal activity. The options were limited, and none of them were good. They could attempt to fight their way out, but the terrain favored the attackers, and civilian casualties would be inevitable. They could try to call for backup, but help was at least 30 minutes away even if helicopters were immediately available. They could attempt to negotiate, but experience had shown that insurgent groups rarely showed mercy to surrounded American forces. Maria found herself thinking about the medical evacuation that had been planned for the boy with the broken leg. The helicopter crew would be flying into what was rapidly developing into a combat zone, and there was no way to warn them in time to change their approach route or abort the mission. If the insurgents had anti-aircraft weapons, which was increasingly common in this part of Afghanistan, the helicopter and its crew would be sitting ducks. The village was beginning to show signs that something was wrong. The village dogs had become agitated, and Some of the older villagers were glancing nervously at the hills around their community. It was possible that some villagers had advance warning of the planned attack, or they might simply have developed the same survival instincts that kept people alive in conflict zones. Sergeant Washington provided another update that made their situation even more precarious. I'm seeing movement from 3 different directions now. They're coordinating a pincer movement to close off our escape routes. Estimated time before they're in position for assault: less than 10 minutes. Maria realized that her medical mission had become something entirely different. Instead of treating wounded civilians, she was about to find herself in a fight for survival against trained fighters who had chosen the time and place of battle. The supplies in her medical kit would be needed for treating combat casualties rather than helping injured children. Private Coleman intercepted a radio transmission that chilled everyone who heard it. They're talking about taking prisoners. Specifically, they mentioned the value of capturing an American female soldier alive. The implications were clear and terrifying. Maria knew exactly what happened to female prisoners captured by insurgent groups, and death in combat would be infinitely preferable to the alternatives. The knowledge added a personal dimension to the tactical situation that made every decision more critical and more desperate. Captain Mitchell made the decision that would define the next hour of their lives. We're not running, and we're not surrendering. We dig in here and hold until support arrives. Rodriguez, get your aid station set up in the most protected position you can find. Washington, give me a defensive plan that protects the civilians while giving us fields of fire. Coleman, get on the radio to base and tell them we need everything they can send us right now. Maria moved quickly to establish a casualty collection point in a partially collapsed building that offered protection from multiple directions. Her medical supplies would be needed soon, as the coming fight would inevitably produce wounded soldiers who would depend on her skills for their survival. The peaceful morning of treating injured children was about to become a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. As she set up her equipment, Maria could hear the sound that confirmed their worst fears: the distinctive noise of multiple weapons being chambered and prepared for action. The insurgents were no longer concerned about concealment, which meant they were confident in their ability to overrun the American position. The coordinated assault was about to begin. The first wave of gunfire lasted exactly 37 seconds, a focused barrage that shattered windows and sent chunks of mud brick flying through the air. Maria pressed herself against the wall of the building where she had established her aid station, her medical training warring with combat instincts she didn't know she possessed. The wounded boy with the broken leg whimpered in terror, and she reached out to place a protective hand on his shoulder while scanning for immediate threats. Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos on their radio frequency. Washington, give me positions on the shooters. Coleman, where's our backup? Rodriguez, stay down and be ready to move if I give the word. Through the noise and confusion, Maria could hear Sergeant Washington calling out tactical information: machine gun position on the ridge to the east, approximately 400 meters. Multiple rifle positions in the rocks to the north. I count at least 8 muzzle flashes from the south approach. The second barrage began before Washington finished his report, this time with the added terror of rocket-propelled grenades exploding against the buildings around them. One RPG struck the wall of the structure where Maria was sheltering, sending a shower of debris through the air and filling her lungs with dust and smoke. The concussion left her ears ringing, but her training kicked in automatically as she checked herself and her patient for injuries. Private Coleman's radio crackled with both good news and bad. Base confirms support en route, but ETA is 25 minutes minimum. Medical evacuation bird is still inbound, ETA 12 minutes, but they're requesting immediate area clearance. 12 minutes. Maria processed this information with the clinical detachment that had carried her through previous combat situations. 12 minutes for a helicopter to reach them, assuming the crew was willing to fly into an active firefight. 25 minutes for ground reinforcements to arrive, assuming they could fight their way through whatever roadblocks the insurgents had established. A scream from outside her building made Maria's blood freeze. One of her teammates had been hit, though she couldn't tell from the sound whether it was a serious wound or minor injury. Every instinct told her to grab her medical kit and rush to help, but Captain Mitchell's voice in her earpiece ordered her to stay in position until they could assess the situation. The tactical picture was becoming clearer as reports came in from her teammates. The insurgents had executed a textbook ambush, using multiple coordinated positions to create overlapping fields of fire that covered all possible escape routes. They had chosen their timing perfectly, waiting until the Americans were focused on medical treatment and spread out among the village buildings. Sergeant Washington's voice carried a new urgency. "Boss, I've got visual on insurgents moving through the buildings to our west. They're attempting to flank us while keeping us pinned down with fire from the ridgeline. I need permission to engage." "Granted," Captain Mitchell responded immediately. "Take them out before they get into position." The sharp crack of Washington's rifle began punctuating the chaos, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Maria could hear the difference between his precise fire and the insurgents' wild spraying, a contrast that spoke to training, discipline, and the kind of marksmanship that comes from thousands of hours of practice. An explosion closer than the others shook Maria's building so violently that part of the roof collapsed. Through the gap, she could see muzzle flashes from insurgent positions that seemed impossibly close. The boy with the broken leg was crying now, and Maria found herself speaking to him in Spanish, the language of her childhood, offering comfort in words he couldn't understand but in a tone that needed no translation. Private Coleman's voice carried desperation barely held in check. "Captain, the helicopter crew is requesting immediate clearance of the landing zone. They need to know if they're flying into a hot LZ or if we can secure the area." Captain Mitchell's response was immediate. "Negative on secure landing zone. Tell them it's hot and getting hotter. They need to abort or find an alternate site." Maria felt her heart sink as she processed this information. The boy with the broken leg needed immediate medical evacuation, but there was no way a helicopter could safely land in the middle of an active firefight. Even if the crew was brave enough to attempt it, they would be putting themselves and their aircraft at extreme risk with little chance of success. Another voice came through their communications, this one belonging to one of the infantrymen who had been manning the defensive perimeter. "Man down. I need a medic over here right now." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. This was the moment she had trained for but hoped would never come, when her role as a healer would conflict with the tactical situation. Someone on her team was wounded and needed immediate medical attention, but reaching them would require exposing herself to enemy fire. Captain Mitchell's voice was firm. "Rodriguez, negative on movement until we can suppress enemy fire in your sector. Washington, can you provide covering fire for medical evacuation?" "Working on it, sir," Washington replied, his rifle continuing its methodical work. "Give me 2 minutes to clear the western approach." 2 minutes felt like an eternity when someone was bleeding. Maria gathered her medical supplies and mentally rehearsed the route to where the wounded soldier was located. She would have to cross approximately 30 meters of open ground under enemy observation, treat the casualty under fire, and then either move him to safety or provide treatment in place until the tactical situation improved. The sound of Washington's rifle changed, becoming more rapid and intense. Through her earpiece, she could hear him calling out targets, multiple insurgents advancing through the buildings. "I count 6, maybe 7, moving tactical. They know what they're doing." Maria realized that this was not a random group of fighters looking for an easy target. The coordination, timing, and tactical sophistication suggested a well-trained unit that had specifically prepared for this engagement. They had studied American tactics, identified weaknesses, and planned an operation designed to overwhelm a small unit through superior numbers and positioning. An RPG exploded so close that the concussion knocked Maria to the ground. When she looked up, she saw daylight through a hole in the wall that hadn't been there moments before. The building was being systematically destroyed around them, and their defensive positions were becoming less tenable with each passing minute. Private Coleman's voice carried information that changed everything. "Captain, I'm monitoring insurgent communications. They're talking about American reinforcements. They know help is coming, and they're planning to withdraw before backup arrives. They want to finish this quickly." The implications were clear and terrifying. The insurgents wearing Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos with crystal clarity. "Rodriguez, move now. Maria exploded from her covered position with speed and precision that surprised even her. Years of physical training combined with adrenaline to propel her across the open ground in a sprint that would have been impressive under normal circumstances and was extraordinary under enemy fire. Bullets snapped through the air around her, but her focus was entirely on reaching the wounded soldier whose life depended on her speed and skill. Private First Class Jake Coleman was down behind a low wall, blood soaking through his uniform from what appeared to be a serious leg wound. Maria slid into position beside him like a baseball player stealing home, her medical kit already opened before she came to a complete stop. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away fabric to expose the wound while her eyes assessed the tactical situation around them. "Where else are you hit?" she asked Coleman, her voice calm despite the bullets impacting the wall above their heads. "Just the leg, I think," Coleman gasped. "Feels like it's broken. Burns like hell." Maria's initial assessment revealed a gunshot wound to Coleman's upper thigh that had probably fractured his femur, but missed the major arteries. It was serious, but treatable if she could stop the bleeding and stabilize the fracture. What concerned her more was their position, which offered minimal cover and was being targeted by multiple insurgent fighters who could see their location. Sergeant Washington's voice crackled through their communications. "Rodriguez, you've got 3 fighters moving to flank your position from the south. They're using the buildings for cover, but they'll have a clear shot at you in about 60 seconds. Maria looked up from her patient to see muzzle flashes from insurgent weapons that seemed impossibly close. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional medical treatment would be impossible under these conditions. She needed to move Coleman to better cover, but his injury made that extremely difficult without risking further damage. That was when Maria made the decision that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Instead of trying to move her patient or calling for help, she drew her sidearm with her left hand while continuing to apply pressure to Coleman's wound with her right. The first insurgent fighter appeared around the corner of a building approximately 40 meters away, his AK-47 already rising toward her position. Maria's 9mm pistol came up in a smooth motion that seemed to happen without conscious thought, years of shooting practice translating into muscle memory that functioned independently of fear or stress. Her first shot took the insurgent center mass, dropping him immediately. The sound of her pistol was different from the chaotic noise of the firefight around them, sharper and more focused, like punctuation in a sentence written in gunfire. The second insurgent appeared before his companion had even hit the ground, but Maria was already tracking toward the new threat. Her second shot was as accurate as the first, demonstrating the kind of marksmanship that comes only from thousands of hours of practice combined with natural talent. "Holy shit," Coleman whispered, his eyes wide despite his pain. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Maria didn't answer because there wasn't time. Her radio crackled with Sergeant Washington's voice. "Rodriguez, outstanding shooting. You bought us some breathing room, but there are more coming. Can you move Coleman to better cover?" Instead of attempting to move her wounded teammate, Maria made another decision that defied conventional tactical doctrine. She positioned herself in a defensive stance over Coleman's prone form and called out on the radio, "Negative on moving Coleman. His position becomes my position. I'll defend from here." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in military training schools. As insurgent fighters continued to advance on their position, Maria Rodriguez transformed from a combat medic into something else entirely. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure and make precise movements under stress. Her years of shooting practice had given her extraordinary marksmanship skills, combined with a protective instinct that made her absolutely determined to save Coleman's life. These skills created a lethal combination that the attacking insurgents were completely unprepared for. Over the next 8 minutes, Maria engaged 12 different insurgent fighters while simultaneously treating Coleman's wounds. Her pistol fire was methodical and devastatingly accurate, each shot carefully aimed and effectively placed. She reloaded twice without missing a beat, her hands moving with the same precision whether she was applying bandages or loading ammunition. The insurgents had planned their ambush around overwhelming a small group of soldiers through superior numbers and coordinated fire. What they hadn't planned for was encountering someone who could provide accurate return fire while performing medical treatment, someone who could multitask between healing and killing with equal effectiveness. Captain Mitchell watched in amazement as Maria systematically dismantled the insurgent assault. Rodriguez, what's your ammunition status? 2 magazines remaining. Maria replied while applying a pressure bandage to Coleman's leg. Coleman is stabilized, but needs evacuation soon. How's our backup looking? Inbound ETA 8 minutes. Mitchell responded. Think you can hold that long? Maria's answer came in the form of 2 more precise pistol shots that dropped insurgent fighters who had been attempting to flank their position from the east. Her situational awareness was extraordinary, allowing her to track multiple threats while continuing to monitor Coleman's medical condition. Sergeant Washington provided tactical updates that painted a picture of an ambush falling apart. Enemy fighters are beginning to withdraw from positions on the ridgeline. They've taken significant casualties and appear to be losing coordination. The truth was that the insurgent assault had been carefully planned around specific expectations of American military behavior. They had studied previous engagements and identified patterns they could exploit. What they hadn't anticipated was encountering someone like Maria Rodriguez, whose combination of skills fell outside their experience and planning. Private Coleman, despite his pain and the surreal nature of watching his medic single-handedly repel an enemy assault, managed to maintain his communication equipment. Base, this is Eagle 6-4. Rodriguez has broken the enemy assault. I say again, Rodriguez has neutralized multiple insurgent fighters while providing medical treatment. Request immediate backup to secure the area. The radio response from base operations came with a note of disbelief. Eagle 6-4, please confirm previous transmission. Did you say your medic has neutralized enemy fighters? Confirmed, Coleman replied, watching as Maria placed another precisely aimed shot that sent insurgent fighters scrambling for cover. Rodriguez has engaged and neutralized at least 8 enemy fighters while treating my wounds. She's held this position single-handed for the past 10 minutes. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as American reinforcements finally reached the area. Maria continued her defensive position until she was certain that coalition forces had secured the immediate vicinity. Only then did she holster her weapon and return her full attention to Coleman's medical needs. When Captain Mitchell reached their position, accompanied by reinforcements from the Quick Reaction Force, he found Maria calmly checking Coleman's pulse while empty brass casings from her pistol lay scattered around their position. The area around them told the story of what had happened. Multiple insurgent fighters lay where Maria's accurate fire had stopped their advance. Rodriguez, Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and respect. I've never seen anything like that in 15 years of military service. You saved Coleman's life and probably prevented them from overrunning our entire position. Maria looked up from her patient with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the engagement. Sir, I did what needed to be done. Coleman needed medical treatment, and I wasn't going to let anyone stop me from providing it. The medical evacuation helicopter that had been circling at a safe distance was finally able to land. As Maria supervised Coleman's loading onto the aircraft, word of what had happened was already spreading through military communication channels. The story of the medic who had held off an enemy assault while treating wounded soldiers was the kind of event that would be studied and retold for years to come. Later investigation would reveal that Maria's defensive action had killed 7 insurgent fighters and wounded several others, effectively breaking the coordinated assault and forcing the survivors to retreat. Her marksmanship was remarkable under any circumstances, but performing at that level while simultaneously providing medical care under combat conditions was unprecedented. As the helicopters lifted off carrying Coleman to advanced medical treatment, Maria began the routine task of checking her remaining teammates for injuries and gathering scattered equipment. To her, what had happened was simply what the situation required. She had been trained to preserve life, and when preserving one life required taking others, she had done what was necessary without hesitation. The village elder approached as American forces secured the area. Through the interpreter, he expressed gratitude not just for the medical care, but for the protection Maria and her team had provided to his community. The insurgent attack would have inevitably resulted in civilian casualties if it had succeeded, and her actions had protected innocent people as well as American soldiers. Word of Maria Rodriguez's actions would spread far beyond the immediate military community. Her story would become an example of courage, skill, and dedication that exemplified the best qualities of American military service. But as she packed her medical equipment and prepared for the return journey to base, Maria was already thinking about the next mission, the next opportunity to help people who needed medical care. Years later, when people asked her about those 12 minutes that made her a legend, Maria would always deflect attention away from the combat aspects of the story. To her, the most important part wasn't the insurgent fighters she had neutralized, but the fact that Private Coleman had made a full recovery and returned to duty. That was what mattered to someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to preserving and protecting the lives of others. The insurgents who had planned the ambush had made one critical error in their intelligence gathering. They had correctly identified Maria Rodriguez as a medic, someone trained to save lives rather than take them. What they had failed to understand was that sometimes, saving one life requires being willing to fight for it with everything you have. On that day, in a remote Afghan village, Maria Rodriguez had proven that the most dangerous enemy is often the one you underestimate. Planning an extended firefight, they were trying to overrun the American position before reinforcements could arrive. This meant the next few minutes would see them taking greater risks and applying maximum pressure to end the engagement on their terms. Maria heard the distinctive sound of insurgent fighters calling to each other in Pashto, their voices much closer than before. They were advancing under cover of the barrage, using military tactics to close the distance while maintaining suppressive fire. Washington's rifle was holding some of them back, but there were too many approaching from too many directions. The wounded soldier called out again, his voice weaker than before. Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to reach him regardless of the tactical situation. As a medic, she had sworn an oath to preserve life, and she wasn't going to let one of her teammates bleed to death while she waited for the perfect moment to act. Captain Mitchell must have read her mind because his voice came through her earpiece. Rodriguez, prepare to move on my mark. Washington, I need maximum suppression on the western approach. Coleman, guide Rodriguez to the casualty position. Maria checked her weapon one final time, gathered her medical kit, and prepared to make the run that would either save a life or cost her own. Through the chaos and noise of combat, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. In a few seconds, she would find out whether all those hours at the shooting range back in Texas had prepared her for the most important test of her life. The moment had arrived when Maria Rodriguez, combat medic, would discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The village elder approached Captain Mitchell one final time, his weathered face showing a mixture of fear, sorrow, and determination. Through the interpreter, he explained that his people would take shelter in the strongest buildings and stay out of the fighting. He also provided crucial intelligence. The insurgents had been planning this attack for weeks, waiting for exactly this opportunity, and they had brought heavy weapons including rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. Maria checked her sidearm, a 9mm pistol that she had qualified expert with, but never expected to use in combat. As a medic, her primary weapon was supposed to be her medical training, not her marksmanship skills. But she had spent years at shooting ranges back home in Texas, hours that had seemed like hobby time, but were about to become the difference between life and death. The sound of gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, the sharp crack of AK-47 rifles mixing with the deeper roar of machine guns. The coordinated assault had begun, and Maria's peaceful medical mission had transformed into the fight of her life. As bullets began striking the buildings around them, she realized that the next few minutes would test every skill she had ever learned and determine whether any of them would live to see another day. The boy with the broken leg looked up at her with terrified eyes as explosions shook the building around them. Maria knelt beside him and spoke in the calm, reassuring tone she had perfected for treating patients under stress. Everything's going to be okay. We're here to protect you. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she would be able to keep that promise. Captain Mitchell listened to the translation with interest. Regular medical missions could be an excellent way to build relationships with local communities while gathering intelligence about insurgent activity in the region. It was exactly the kind of initiative that higher command levels encouraged, showing tangible benefits to civilian populations while advancing broader strategic objectives. Maria was packing up some of her equipment when she noticed something that made her pause. One of the village dogs, which had been sleeping peacefully in the shade near the well, suddenly raised its head and began showing signs of agitation. The animal's behavior was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read environmental cues for signs of danger. At almost the same moment, Private Coleman looked up from his radio with a slight frown. He had been monitoring multiple frequencies as part of his standard communication protocols, and something in the pattern of radio traffic was beginning to concern him. It was nothing obvious or dramatic, just a subtle shift in the normal background chatter that suggested other units in the area were starting to pay attention to something. Sergeant Washington's voice came through their headsets, calm but alert. "Boss, I've got movement on the ridge line to the east. Looks like it might be more than the shepherds we observed earlier. Could be nothing, but it's worth keeping an eye on." Maria felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came with the transition from routine operations to potential danger. After months of deployment, she had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to changes in atmosphere that preceded trouble. The shift was rarely dramatic or obvious, more like a subtle alteration in the rhythm of daily life that suggested something was about to go wrong. The villagers around them seemed unaware of any change, continuing their conversations and going about their daily activities with the same peaceful energy they had maintained all morning. Children still played near the well, women continued preparing food for their families, and men discussed farming and livestock with the casual intensity that marked rural life everywhere. But Maria could feel it now, that almost electric tension that preceded combat situations. Years of training and experience had taught her to trust these instincts, even when she couldn't identify specific reasons for concern. Something was shifting in the environment around them, and she began mentally reviewing the locations of her equipment and the defensive positions her teammates had established. Could immediately assess the situation. 3 children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, sat on mats with their families nearby. Their injuries appeared to be from shrapnel, painful but not life-threatening if treated properly. An elderly man lay on another mat, his injuries more serious but still manageable with the supplies she had brought. As Maria began setting up her equipment, she felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with being able to help people who were suffering. This was why she had become a medic, why she endured the stress and danger of military life. In moments like these, everything else faded away except the immediate need to reduce pain and promote healing. Outside, she could hear the routine sounds of her team establishing security. Radio checks, position reports, and quiet conversations as they settled into what they expected to be a few hours of peaceful humanitarian work. The morning was progressing exactly as planned, which should have been reassuring but somehow made Maria feel more alert rather than relaxed. Experience had taught her that in Afghanistan, when things seemed to be going too smoothly, it was often because trouble was waiting just out of sight, gathering strength for the moment when it would strike with maximum impact. But as she began cleaning the wounds of the youngest child, a girl with large dark eyes who reminded her of her own niece back home, Maria pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the work that needed to be done. The village felt calm, her team was professional and alert, and her patients were responding well to treatment. By every measure that mattered, this was turning into exactly the kind of mission that military planners hoped for, helping civilians, building relationships with local communities, and demonstrating that American forces were there to protect rather than threaten. What Maria couldn't know, as she worked to clean and bandage wounds in that dim building, was that less than 2 miles away, a group of insurgents was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would turn her routine medical mission into something very different indeed. They had been watching the village for days, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, and now their patience was about to be rewarded.